Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 5 of Lifespan Development. This is a little bit of a shorter chapter. We're going to go over gross and fine motor development and a couple perceptual senses. With that, the book does cover a lot more senses, very briefly, but we will dive into a little more depth on what we see change in vision and hearing over the course of the lifespan. So let's jump into some motor development, and we'll start with reflexes. So reflexes are an unlearned behavior. It is built into our genetics. They probably had survival value, and it's a simple reaction to stimuli. Well, sometimes they can be kind of complex as well. So a good example of this is the rooting reflex. So if you touch a baby's cheek or anywhere on a baby's face, really, they will move their face towards whatever is touching it and try to start sucking on it. So that's great if it is something like a nipple or a bottle. Not so good if that's something like a Lego. So do be careful. Also, siblings' dirty hands or something like that. So be careful around babies with what they are trying to put in their own mouths through that reflex. With this, the rooting reflex, anytime anything is touching their cheek, they will move their face towards it and try to suck on that thing. So another reflex, which I'm not sure why this isn't, my keyboard's not clicking forward, is the sucking reflex. So the sucking reflex is just when there is something in their mouth, they will try to suck on it. Again, make sure that it's something they should be sucking on and not something like a Lego. Mouths, as we've learned before, and a little bit in this chapter as well, mouths have a lot of sensory organs, and our brain has a lot of space dedicated to them. So it's also a thing that later on children put things in their mouths to learn more about them too. So my favorite reflex is the Moro reflex. This is caused by either a startling noise or movement. So in this picture, the doctor has actually got like a nice little mattress behind the baby. They're holding them up a little bit above the mattress. They'll drop them like 3 or 4 inches and catch them. So baby's totally safe to test this reflex. It's a pretty funny reflex because when something startles the baby, they will spread their arms out and try to grab things, and their eyes will often open really wide too. So it looks pretty funny. If it ever happens to, say, kids or nieces or nephews on accident, it's pretty funny to see. I would definitely never do that on purpose to my kids when they were very, very tiny. So with that being said, let's talk about some gross motor skills. These are things that are actually developing. These are things that you need to learn and practice over time. So gross motor skills are simply the ones that require larger muscle groups. So things like your chest, back muscles, leg muscles, those are gross motor skills. You're moving your arms, you're walking. Again, with these gross motor skills, a lot of it is down to trial and error. So with that too, perception also helps. Right? So we'll talk about in a little while about the ear and the semicircular canals there, and that is a big part of our balance. Well, you have to perceive that balance and perceive that you're upright versus falling over, and as well as have the muscle control of your legs to be able to walk. It's a really complicated series of things that you need to be doing to do something like walking or running. And so it takes time to practice and develop those skills. Part of that's also the neural development. A lot of these skills are also down to the connections in your brain, making connections with the muscles, making connections in the brain to the various sensory and motor areas, and the balance areas, all the sensory inputs at once to be able to know where you are in space and how you can move and develop the ability to do those things. Part of it, especially early on in life, is also the myelination of the brain. Some of these things can speed up as the neurons get myelinated, so the processes are easier. It takes less cognitive energy and effort for a child to walk later on than it does really early on in life. All right, so here is a little image kind of showing the progression of what we kind of expect from an infant up until about age 1. So about age 1, so 11, 12 months is when we usually see children taking some of their first steps. But again, there's a range to each of these. So this is a nice little chart, kind of depicts it pretty well. But this chart really goes to show you where the majority, so there still are, even on the sides of these ranges. There are still people that do these a little earlier or a little bit later as well. So this is the average where most children fall into. So good thing to be aware of if you are caring for children as, say, a nurse or physical therapist, or you are working in any kind of doctor's office or things like that, to know that this is kind of the expected progression. With that, parents are often very worried that their children are not meeting these steps. They're like, oh, um, it's now 5 months and my child is not sitting without support. Well, you can say, well, it's pretty normal. Like that would be actually a little unusual to be so early on. So 6.5, 7 months is kind of when you can expect that. That doesn't always soothe their fears, but then bringing up these things can also help you see if there are any kind of delays. So like I said, these are the averages. If someone is over here, so not sitting with support until 10 or 11 months, there might be things to look into to make sure that their gross and fine motor development is developing appropriately. It could be that they have something like an inner ear problem where their balance is off, right? Or it could be that they are just one of the individuals that is sitting up a little bit later, right? It's totally very individual. And if there are worries, that is what we should look into is if you are worried and if the doctor is worried and the parent is worried, start to investigate any potential things. But again, these are the averages. There are people who do it earlier, people who do it later. So keep that in mind. All right, with that, gross motor skills really help with a lot of social interaction. So we see a group of kids here playing in a field. They're doing gross motor skills. It looks like they're probably running. They're holding hands as they're running. So that takes a lot of coordinated movement. So at age 3, we can expect things like hopping, some jumping, some running. At age 4, we can see those things getting better. We often see around age 4 a lot more limit testing, like trying to do more and more. Sometimes children can get frustrated if they're not able to do as much as, say, a kid that's a little bit further on than them or a year older than them. But at 5, there's a lot more adventurous risk taking, a lot more gross motor skills. So these gross motor skills are being developed pretty quickly overall, getting to close to adult levels very early on in life. So thinking about these gross motor skills, if they're not meeting these benchmarks, if they are behind all of their peers, they might be left out of team sports and games. And that can have a big impact on their motivation to do sports. They might have lower self-worth. They might not have as many opportunities to practice social interaction. And so it can have a big impact on young people. So helping all children like be inclusive of other people, like adjusting games, making accommodations, these are really important things, especially if you're in, say, an education kind of setting or you have children of this age, to help them work with other people. Because across the lifespan, there's going to be people with different abilities that you need to work with, right? So starting to learn that early on is easier than learning it later on. All right, so as we go through adolescence, we do see some more improvements in adolescence. And what we see, and I think we mentioned this before as we talked about health, is that adults typically reach their peak physical performance before about age 30. And then we start to see a gradual decline of motor skills. And then we can have dramatic declines past about the age of 75. So with that, you can expect, say, an adolescent, so somewhere in late adolescence to about 30, so 17 to 30, to be pretty capable of doing a lot of a variety of sports. Oftentimes you see athletes, like professional athletes, are in that age range. There's very few that continue on past that point, partially probably because they've got enough money, they don't need to risk their body anymore, and partially because they are starting to see any decline of performance or maybe increases of injuries as well. So there's multiple components to that, not just being out of the physical peak. So another big thing as we go into later adulthood is maintaining our capacities, maintaining those gross motor capacities. So a big thing is maintaining mobility. So whatever kind of mobility you have, whether it's mobility in a wheelchair or mobility being able to walk around, continuing to be as active and independent as you can into late adulthood is very, very good. It's really correlated with being able to interact with people, being able to get out of the house, do new things, try new things, which is very good for your cognitive health and for your longevity over time. So use accommodating tools, right? So a wheelchair is is a tool to help you be more independent. So if you need the use of a wheelchair, use a wheelchair. If you need the use of a walker, use a walker. Making sure you can stay as independent. Um, there's a word, it's on the tip of my tongue. It's not accessibility. It's not accommodations. It's similar to those. Same kind of general idea. It's not coming to my brain right now. But these are devices that help you maintain this independence. So, and there tends to be a negative connotation, like if you have to use a walker, if you have to use a wheelchair, especially in later adulthood, if you've never had to before, that you might resist doing that. I know I have family members that are moving into that phase of life where they're needing wheelchairs, and when I go over to their house or something like that, in when they should need be using it, and I can see that they're having trouble getting around and doing things, they're not using it. And so there is a stigma towards these kinds of devices, but hopefully we can change that in society in general, because these kinds of devices really do help you be independent. So with that, with whatever kind of tools that you need to use, maintaining that kind of mobility is very useful. It might be a brace, might be crutches, might be a cane, might be a electric wheelchair, right? There's a variety of tools that exist to help you maintain your independence. And that's really the key, is maintaining your independence and maintaining any kind of mobility. With that, keeping up with exercise, as we talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 4, can really help as well with maintaining capacities over time. Talking to physical therapists about, well, I do have this limitation. I literally can't move, say, this leg, or something like that. What can I do to stay physically fit? And physical therapists are really good about that kind of thing. So another thing with this gross motor development, falls are a leading cause of injury and death in adults over 65. Another reason it worries me when I see family members that aren't using their mobility devices. Is that the term I was looking for? Mobility devices? Because it's to help you be more mobile. But they're not using their mobility devices and they're looking like they'll fall down in the kitchen. And I understand, so especially I have had to use a wheelchair as well, and sometimes it's really hard to do things in a wheelchair. Cupboards that you used to be able to reach really easily are now out of reach. There's all sorts of challenges, but these falls can be really damaging. At that age, your recovery from them tends to be longer as well. Another interesting thing with these falls, kind of a sad but interesting thing, is oftentimes people break their hip and then fall. So you might have heard, oh, they fell and they broke their hip. In reality, because of the loss of bone density, for a lot of older adults getting further on into late adulthood, their hip will literally just break as they are moving around. So the weight of their body, the pressure of them walking, stress fractures created in a hip, their hip will just break as they are moving. Maybe they're coming down a stairs or a step, or they're just walking around. Their hip will break. If your hip breaks, you're going to fall. And so that is kind of an interesting thing that research has found, that that is a fairly common thing to happen. All right, so with that, fine motor skills. So we kind of looked at gross motor skills over the lifespan. Now let's look at some fine motor skills. So fine motor skills are those really finely tuned motions. We're using a lot more smaller muscles. We're using the little ligaments in our fingers. Fine motor skills would also be included in toes, but usually what we're talking about is fingers. So grasping of things, using a spoon, manipulating buttons, doing things on your smartphone. And a lot of this in early childhood is developed just using trial and error. But also as your perceptual abilities increase too. So we talked about perception helping you balance for gross motor skills. Well, perception of being able to see something more clearly, being able to pick it up, having your neurons myelinating to be able to do that better, that's a big part of motor development as well. So reaching and grasping are one of the first motor skills to appear in general. And it really helps because it provides a child with the opportunity to interact with their own environment. It's one of the first like agentic things that we do, that we can choose to say, grab the cup, grab the block, whatever it might be. So for kids, it's very important to provide relevant toys and objects to manipulate. So in a very small child, you might have a stuffed animal and a big block and some other thing around them, that looking around, being able to reach and grasp, move it around safely, those are some of the things that are going to increase those fine motor skills as well as the perceptual abilities. So observational learning and mirror neurons also help in this process. So seeing a parent or a model like go and pick up the cup and like put it down or pick it up and spin it around, that can help the mirror neurons get a start on this process as the brain is learning how to wire up to do these fine motor skills. So by about age 3, children are still a little bit clumsy, but can usually pick things up with their fingers and thumb. At 4, there's a pretty, as we're seeing the brain myelinate in those areas, we're seeing that 4-year-old is getting a lot more precise, but oftentimes in 4-year-olds, kind of like the gross motor skills, they often want to do more than they're capable. Oh, I'm missing a T in this slide. That's funny. So they want to do more than they're capable of at that time. So with that, you might not be able to see a 3-year-old create this kind of Lego set, a 4-year-old maybe, and then a 5-year-old probably would be able to create this kind of Lego set. So you've got some thin pieces and a lot of other pieces attached to that. That would be pretty hard for a 3-year-old, but a 5-year-old quite a bit easier. So with that, a lot of that myelination continues on into early adolescence and late childhood. So late childhood, early adolescence. And by about 10 to 12, our fine motor skills are pretty comparable to adults. So with that, it is the fine motor skills involve a lot of things. They're complex, they're intricate, there's often rapid movements. We don't get to that point until we are about 10 to 12. So this is a kid that I came across my TikTok that plays guitar. They are in, I think now they're 12, but I think in this video they were 10, but they might have been 12. Anyway, they can play guitar much better than I can ever imagine myself playing guitar. So I played guitar many years ago when I was about 12, I started actually. But they are so much better than I ever was. And it's really amazing to see the kind of intricate movements that they are doing. So feel free to look up examples of piano or violin or guitar players or other kinds of people doing really intricate things with their fine motor skills at this kind of early age, because that's about the time we get to like our full potential of fine motor skills. After that point, the myelination of those areas is done. You've got a lot of practice with a lot of fine motor skills, and any kind of improvements are basically your neural networks making more networks for those things. Right? So it's not just because of the brain, but it's also because this young person has practiced a lot on guitar. So they have a lot of neural networks, much more than I do, to play that guitar well. All right, we do see skills declining in late adulthood on average, and we also see dexterity decreasing. And a lot of conditions can lead to weakening or paralysis in hands. So things like arthritis, other chronic pain disorders, that can make it really difficult to do fine motor skills. So that being said, again, if you are using these abilities, if you're doing things like stretching, if you're exercising, again, if you have something like a chronic condition or arthritis, talk to a doctor about recommendations for how to keep the abilities and maintain those over time, because that is change over time, right? And so we can keep those as long as we are able to. So some things to be aware of in regards to fine motor skills. So with this, I want to bring up a point that I've kind of alluded to a few times already, and that's dynamic systems theory. So motor skills are developing as your perception and the brain connections are happening too. So those are developing at the same time. So you've got your perception that you're getting better at, you've got your brain connections, making new networks for things like playing a guitar, and this enables more and more complex actions as you practice your motor skills. So both gross and fine motor skills. And in early childhood throughout adolescence, motivation leads to new behaviors. And then you perfect those behaviors through practice. So it's a pretty simple idea, dynamic systems theory. So if you want to do something, if you want to grab that block, if you want to play guitar, you'll be motivated to do that. You will improve those capacities. You will get better at it over time, because multiple components of your biology, your brain, your cognition, your perception, your actual muscles as well, are getting better at doing these things. So it's dynamic. There's lots of systems involved in doing these fine and gross motor skills. Right, so I think so the main idea here with dynamic systems is that motivations lead to new behaviors. And these new behaviors do get perfected through practice. We'll watch this video, but before we watch that video, I actually want to go back to the previous slide and tell you why I have this carrier here. So one of the researchers that I worked with in grad school, one of the main things that they do was run programs for low-income families across the LA area. So oftentimes it would be mothers coming in with children or multiple children, depending on what program it is. It might have only been young children, but oftentimes when it was young children, they would be in a carrier. So the car seat, you pull out and you put it in there. And during, say, an hour and a half class, very often in the first couple meetings, these parents would just leave the child in the carrier, which I understand as a parent, if you take the child out of the carrier, they might get into something else. They might distract other people. They might give you more work. You have to pay attention to them as well as what's happening in this lesson kind of thing. And so it's a challenge, but especially since they were a developmental psychologist and they were trying to work with these people about good things to do with your kids and helping with parenting and things like that, they said, hey, let's take the kids out of the carriers. And so they made sure the room was safe and things like that. They put blankets down, a variety of toys, and had the kids interact with them. So that interaction for the 1.5 hours a week, that even that little bit is helping their brains to make these kinds of connections, to get better at these dynamic systems of their fine and gross motor abilities. The kids interacted with each other, interacted with more parents, heard a variety of voices and sounds and things, and overall everybody was a lot happier and had more fun, like as a big community in these classes, and it was better overall for all the people. So while you think about like what do children need, it's pretty simple overall. They need to be interacting with people, they need to be interacting with things, they need to be playing and be kept safe as they're doing that. So being in a car seat might keep them safe, might keep them quiet during a meeting, but what the child probably needs is a little more interaction with even simple things, like even a simple thing like putting some toys that are hanging down that they can reach and grab for at a very young age is a good idea. So that is what dynamic systems is all about. Now let's watch this video about that really gets at dynamic systems and shows us quite a few examples of fine and gross motor development through early childhood.
Gross motor skills help infants get around in their environment. Here, 2-week-old Anna Marie displays a crawling motion and tries to pick up her head. Mac, who is 3 months old, can hold his head up and push with his arms quite well. Alex, who's 5 months old, demonstrates his preference for being upright by jumping with support from his father. He also provides a striking example of infant motivation as he tries to crawl toward the rattle.
So here we're seeing a very simple example of motivation. So the rattle, it's interesting, it's novel, it's something that they want to get to, and that motivates them to try new movements. So very simple there, and then we can compare that and see that all the way up to that kid who was really great at guitar. That's motivation. So that motivation leads to new behaviors, and then you get better at those actions through practicing them.
Here's Hannah at 7 months. She crawls, rolls, starts to balance in a sitting position, which permits her to transfer objects from hand to hand and hold 2 objects at once. Here she pulls to a stand. 8-month-old Randy sits with good balance and crawls with a toy in his hand. Randy can also stand up with a little help from his mother. New motor accomplishments change the way parents interact with their child. For example, parents' expressions of affection and game playing increase as their independently moving baby seeks them out for greetings, hugs, and entertainment. And
So that's an example, again, of these dynamic systems. So there are systems even outside the child that they are affecting. So the systems of their family, the systems of their peers. So as they're able to interact more, the peers can do things like play a game of tag versus before they couldn't do that because they didn't have the gross motor ability, maybe not even the language ability at that point. So here we see it's a nice video to show quite a few examples at different ages of these kinds of systems working and what we can kind of expect from a variety of children.
Babies' expressions of delight as they work on new motor competencies trigger pleasure in others. This encourages the child's efforts further. Fine motor development has to do with smaller movements, such as reaching and grasping. Here, 2-week-old Anna Marie directs her arms toward a rattle. These movements are called pre-reaching because they resemble poorly coordinated swipes or swings.
So before it jumps to the next baby showing you a little bit more advanced than that, you might have looked at that and been like, is that really reaching? And so that's some of the ways that we use some of the techniques like eye tracking and habituation to see if children, which we'll get to in the sensory and perception piece in just a minute. But this is a good example of we can see where children are interested in. We have this rattle till they get bored. Then we bring in a new rattle and see, are they trying to interact with it? It's a good way to see, well, what is their attention? What can they perceive and see and differentiate from? But also, are they interested? Are they actually motivated to get this thing? And even though that might look like a pretty ineffective way to grab a rattle, you got to remember this baby is developing the neural connections to be able to eventually grab that rattle. So let's see a baby at the kind of next step of jump of this ability.
6-week-old Kara swipes at an object in front of her. Around 3 months, voluntary reaching begins and gradually.
So with that, you kind of see those steps, like not very close to getting the rattle, much closer to getting the rattle, and then we'll see being able to grab what you're motivated to grab.
Improves. Here, 5-month-old Alex demonstrates reaching with the ulnar grasp, a clumsy motion in which the fingers close against the palm. Then, Alex explores the object with his mouth. Randy's hands have become coordinated enough, at age 8 months, to hold and explore objects smoothly and effortlessly. 11-month-old Nicole uses the pincer grasp, thumb against the forefinger, to pick a raisin out of her father's hand. Of all motor skills, voluntary reaching is believed to play the greatest role in infant cognitive development, since it opens up a whole new way of exploring the environment. Once reaching and grasping are mastered, they combine with the child's developing cognition and desire to solve new problems, leading to even more advanced manipulation of objects. 23-month-old Zachary is intent on figuring out how to put shapes into the box. 15-month-old Braxton shows off his carpenter skills. And finally, Zach stuffs a Nerf ball into a cup and then intently tries to dig it out with a spoon.
So hopefully you can also see from this example that these toys are really good, appropriate toys for these kinds of ages. So they're not flashy or expensive. Oftentimes they could be just simple blocks, right? Or a cup with a little ball. So these are the kinds of things that children need to be interacting with in very early childhood to develop these things as they are developing their cognition, as they're developing their brain and those networks, as well as those myelinations, as well as they are developing the skill to be able to reach out and grasp something. So the whole video is pretty good. It shows some examples of of children who are behind because of Down syndrome and are not meeting those expected points and how the dynamic systems works there. But for now, we will move on to talk about sensory and perceptual development. So with sensation and perception, first I want to ask you, what do you see in this image? What is here? Pause it for a minute, look at the image for a little while, and write down what you see. So pause the video right now, write down what you see in the image, and then come back. All right, in this image, you are getting a lot of sensations. You are getting basic light data. You are getting the black, you are getting the white of this image. I see an image of a dog. I think it's a Dalmatian to me, especially because it's all black and white spots. It's smelling the ground right here. This is one of its ears. This is its head. This is one of its shoulders and arms. It's got a belly here. It's got one hip and leg, another leg over here, and this is the top of its body right there. So that is a dog. This is the edge of a path, the edge of a sidewalk. This is grassy or dirt over here. This shadow, well, this big black thing is a shadow, and it is the shadow of a tree. So here is the tree's trunk, and this is the ground around the tree. It might also be like sometimes you leave dirt around a tree, and then this is grass around that. But that is what I see. That's what I perceive. So the sensation here is the basic data of the light and dark. You're getting sensory data in your eyes. The perception is, what do you actually see? So I've never seen the original picture before it was like put into black and white and made more pixelated. So I don't actually know if I'm right. I don't know if that's actually a dog. Maybe it's something else. People have seen quite a few different things, even things like cars or pigs in the image. And that's the thing with sensory senses and perception, is that these are two separate processes. Sensation is just the data we are getting from our sensory organs. So we have our tongue, we have our eyes, we have our ears, nose, skin. Our skin has a lot of sensory sensors. And the data that we are getting, the information coming in through those sensors, is the sensation. The perception is then, what do we do with that? Based on having this data, what does it mean? There's a sound. I'm getting the sensory input of sound. Is that language? Is that music? And then what about what I'm seeing? Is this a color? Is this a shape? Is this a pattern? Your perception is that it's called a top-down process to interpret what the sensation is. And usually that perception has developed over time to help us focus on what's most meaningful in any given situation. So, studying sensation and perception in infants is pretty difficult. Part of that is because infants can't talk and say what they are perceiving, what they're seeing. They can't describe that. So, it's been a hard thing to figure out exactly what infants are capable of hearing, tasting, smelling, seeing at different points in time. So, some of the key research methods that we use to study sensation and perception in infants is habituation and dishabituation. Essentially, with this kind of phenomena, you would put something in front of a baby. Let's say a blue block. So you put this blue block in front of the baby and you let them play with it until they are bored with it. After they're bored, present a similar stimuli. So maybe you'll start with something purple, because people tend to like novel things, be more interested in novel things if they pay attention and start playing with the purple block. And enough babies do that, it might suggest that a baby at that age can determine the difference between blue and purple. You can make that even harder. You can have two different shades of blue blocks. See if the baby can tell the difference. If they tell the difference enough that they see it as something new. So doing that with enough babies, so a big enough sample of babies can get you a pretty good sense of what babies can like see or hear or even taste that is different. Another thing that we do is eye tracking. So oftentimes babies will look at something that they are more interested in. And usually we're more interested in something novel. So we can put cameras on a baby's head like this. We can have machines that have cameras in it to watch what a baby is looking at. And a lot of these studies, especially this cap one, you can put this cap on, and while the child is moving around a room, you can be tracking what they see. So here's a little camera on the baby's head. And I'm pretty sure this is a battery right here. But you've got a camera, you've got a view of what the baby sees, you've got a view of the baby's eye, so you can see what is the baby paying attention to. So you can put those together too. You can do the habituation and dishabituation with the eye tracking cameras as well. So those are some of the main ways we have been able to see what infants, what newborns, what even up to, say, a year old are able to sense and perceive differently. So let's start with vision. At birth, Newborns are very nearsighted. So in the womb as a fetus, we don't get much practice with using our eyes. So our eyes are not very well developed. We have basically slightly more light, slightly more dark, and not a wide variety of colors prenatally. So it takes up to about 6 months to get to about 20/40 vision. So also you can't perceive, well, infants can't seem to perceive occluded objects like this cat behind the bar until about 2 months. So a 3-month-old will probably be able to tell that this is a cat. They've had enough experience with things, passing behind things that they can kind of fill in the gaps. Like, oh, this is a different color, this is a different shape than this thing, so this is probably something separate behind it. That takes practice. You don't just know that right off the bat. You have the genes lined up to where the visual center of your brain is, but your brain still needs to wire up this perception of this is how to use these materials in the brain. So this is a good little picture of showing this is about what a 1-month-old can see from about arm's length away. This is at about 2 months old, 3 months old, and 1 year old, and that's pretty close to adult vision at that point. So with this, especially very early on, we're very nearsighted. As we get closer to 6 months, we're not as nearsighted, like it said, 20/40. But very early on, we can see just about things clearly only just about as far as a face is, which is one of the reasons that we are able to practice with faces. You can imagine, say, a parent holding a child pretty close. That child is looking at the parent's face, so starting to detect features of a face. A lot of human interaction is based on facial emotion and expression, and so with that, we learn that pretty early on. Another thing is depth perception. Luckily, infants start to figure out depth perception about at the time they are starting to crawl. So it appears at about 3 to 4 months old. So a 6-month-old would probably not crawl out onto this glass. So it looks like a cliff. Obviously, the baby is actually safe. There's plexiglass here, so it will not fall. But it doesn't know that, right? It's not. It probably hasn't experienced these kinds of things before. So this is a test to see can they perceive that drop. If they hesitate and don't want to go over, that might indicate, well, they can perceive there's a drop there. So this is an interesting test, looking not just at that drop, but also at socio-emotional factors like a parent's face. Are they afraid or are they happy towards the baby? And how that impacts their likelihood of walking off a cliff like Wile E. Coyote. So let's watch that really quickly.
In this study, babies between 9 and 12 months are brought into the lab and placed on a large plexiglass top table. Half of the table has a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, but halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure, and this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get across to get the toy, but she's cautious.
So this behavior right here, you can tell this baby can tell there is a cliff right there. They are wary, they are testing it. They're like, I don't want to crawl out onto this. So they have that depth perception.
And looks to the opposite end of the table where her mother is. The parent is instructed to smile or make a fear face.
If the mother is posing a fear face, the baby typically does not cross this stair step downward, this modified visual cliff or visual step. On the other hand, if the mother poses a smile or somehow poses a nonverbal communication that is not prohibitive but encouraging, the child is much more likely to cross over to her.
So there's that baby looking like Wile E. Coyote, going just off of the cliff and staying up. Yeah, that is an interesting way to adjust this same experiment to look at socio-emotional factors as well as the visual perception. All right, so with this, vision does stay about the same across the lifespan. So from about 3 to 4, all the way until we start losing vision capacities with aging. So visual decline in late adulthood is also correlated with things like fewer social contacts. So that could be a causal relationship in that if your vision is failing, maybe you don't want to hang out as much because you are having a hard time getting to a place where social events are happening. Maybe it makes it difficult for you to interact with people because you can't see as well. So that's why something like glasses or contacts or other accessibility devices like bifocals are very helpful for someone with that kind of vision that is failing them. Yeah, other than that, we generally keep pretty consistent vision on average across the lifespan after pretty early childhood. So some of the main declines that we see as we get into late adulthood are a bigger difficulty focusing. So the actual muscles that move the lens to focus it in the eye, those can deteriorate and become weaker or slower. And so that's why some people might need bifocal or even trifocal lenses. Color vision perception starts to worsen. So the cones. The cones in the eye are the color receptors, and so those are not performing as well. And then slower processing of light data, and then also worse night vision. And motion sensitivity lowers, so all these things get slightly worse, especially after the age of 75. So some diseases that are pretty common as we get into late adulthood are cataracts. Cataracts are essentially a thickening of the eye's lens, and it essentially makes it more cloudly or distorted. There are surgeries to replace the eye's lens with an implanted lens rather than your own biological lens that can make it so it's a lot easier to see. That procedure isn't too intensive, but again, you need access to healthcare and the funds to be able to do something like that. Even say going through Medicare is not always going to be an easy process to get a cataract surgery done. So glaucoma is another one that's fairly common in a later adulthood, so post 70 and 75. And this is damage to the optic nerve. Essentially, you've got fluid buildup in the eye and it's pushing on those axons and those neurons themselves, and that can literally damage and hurt them or even kill some of those nerves. And that in and of itself can make it more difficult to see a lot of different things. And then this picture right here is a picture of macular degeneration. So this is a deterioration in the retina's macula. So basically, in the very center of your retina, the area that you're getting the most sensory data, it's the most highly packed with rods and cones. Lots of cones there, less cones as you get out around the edges of the eye, more cones as you go out around the edges of the eye. But those are getting damaged or deteriorating, and that means the very center of your focal vision, the sharpest point of your vision, is gone now. So again, a lot of these have different methods to mitigate or manage them or maintain your visual capacity over the lifespan. Right, another really cool thing is your hearing. So a lot of people already know about things like taste buds. You probably already have heard of rods and cones, but a lot of people don't actually know how you hear things. So we often think, oh, it's a sound, it changes and it's a wave, so our brain picks that up somehow. But it's a really interesting process, a pretty complicated process of multiple steps to basically get what is called a hair cell to push against a membrane. And that pushing of the membrane against the hair cell causes the hair cell to fire and send a message. So it is mechanoreception, very similar in some ways to some of your skin sensors. So the touch on your skin is a very similar sensation to actually how you are hearing things. So let's watch this video on hearing and learn how hearing happens. I might skip around a couple parts in it to focus on some things because we really need to just focus on a couple pieces of the video. It does go over more biology than you necessarily need to know for this class. But if you're in an anatomy class, feel free to watch the entire thing, but we won't watch it all right now. All right, I'm gonna scroll forward to here's the actual ear.
In the air into electrical impulses, which can be interpreted by the brain. As sound enters the ear, it passes through the external auditory canal, where it meets the tympanic membrane.
You might have heard of the tympanic membrane as the eardrum.
The tympanic membrane then vibrates in response to the sound. Sounds of a lower pitch or frequency produce a slower rate of vibration, and sounds of lower volume or amplitude produce a less dramatic vibration. Higher frequency sounds produce faster vibrations. The tympanic membrane is cone-shaped and articulates with a chain of 3 bones called the auditory ossicles.
Right, and so these basically rotate and are kind of held on by ligaments within your ear. I think it does show the rotation here.
They consist of the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The movements of the tympanic membrane vibrate the ossicles, passing on the information of frequency.
All right, so you can see that's kind of, with the vibration of the eardrum, it is slightly moving and it is pushing this end piece, which is called the stapes, but for our purposes, you don't need to memorize those different ear pieces. So we will see what happens at where it's connecting.
The stapes moves with a piston-like action, which sends vibrations into a structure called the bony labyrinth.
So this is the main area where you have a bunch of hair cells within your inner ear. So this is the cochlea over here, and then on the left side you've got semicircular canals, which is essentially where we get our sensation of balance. So are you straight up? Are you lying down? Are you falling at the moment? And all of that is run essentially by fluid flowing through here and having hair cells at a variety of places. So over here, those hair cells send data that we interpret that sensation as sound. Over here, we interpret the data from the hair cells as like balance. Where is your body in space in relative to gravity? So they're filled with fluid. I'll actually jump forward a bit. So here's the fluid, and we'll zoom in on the cochlea right here.
Vibrations produced by the stapes are drawn into the spiral system and return to meet the round window. The portion of the spiral passage in which vibrations ascend to the apex of the cochlea is called the scala vestibuli. The descending portion of the passage is called the scala tympani.
All right, so when that stapes is moving, so when your eardrum is moving, the stapes is moving, it is vibrating this fluid. It vibrates up and then vibrates down. And what we are going to focus on is actually a little triangle right in here.
A third structure, called the cochlear duct, is situated between the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani. The cochlear duct is filled with a fluid called endolymph, and when viewed in cross-section, the membranes separating the two fluid-filled systems are visible.
All right, so right here, before it zooms in even further, these are hair cells. This is where your sensory input of hearing comes from, is these little tiny sensory cells inside your ear. So again, this is the little triangle area with a different fluid. This is the cochlear fluid. So I'm going to zoom out. We've got the eardrum, we've got the bones that are pushing against the cochlea right here, this whole big structure. And so those vibrations go up and then come down. So and then in this area that right here is pink, that is where the actual hair cells are.
Membrane are visible. They are Reissner's membrane and the basilar membrane. The membranes are flexible and move in response to the vibrations traveling up the scala vestibuli. The movements of the membranes then send vibrations back down to the scala tympani. A specialized structure called the organ of Corti is situated on the basilar membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the organ of Corti is stimulated, which sends nerve impulses to the brain via the cochlear nerve.
All right, so that is our final zoom in. So we are inside the inner ear. So zooming back out, so we have the eardrum, the bones, they're pushing here, there's fluid all filled in here, and so inside there are these little nerves called hair cells. So there is their axon going towards the message centers of the brain so that we can then perceive the sounds. This is a membrane on top of it, and these little hairs are what get pushed, literally pushed by that membrane as things are vibrating to then send a signal that I've been signaled, I've been touched, essentially. And that is where your hearing comes from.
The actual nerve impulses are generated by specialized cells within the organ of Corti called hair cells. The hair cells are closely covered by a structure called the tectorial membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the tiny clusters of hairs are bent against the tectorial membrane, triggering the hair cells to fire. The entire basilar membrane does not vibrate simultaneously.
All right, so before it gets into pitch of where we hear low and high, I do want to point out that if you have, say, a cochlear implant, essentially that is an implant that sends a wire or multiple wires into your cochlea and essentially tries to intentionally activate certain hair cells. So what a person hears with a cochlear implant is not the same as what a person without a cochlear implant is hearing from just the sound vibrating. You're essentially kind of pretending to be a sound. You're pretending to be these neurons firing so that the nerves will send a message. So essentially, if you get a cochlear implant, you have to learn how to hear. Right? So it's not the same as a person who doesn't need a cochlear implant, and it sounds very different. It can be very difficult to distinguish speech and sound. It's not as well designed as, say, our ears have evolved, so it can be very hard when there's multiple sounds. So a lot of people actually choose not to do a cochlear implant. It is pretty invasive, right? The cochlea is pretty far inside your head. So some people do choose to do it though, and essentially what you have is in essence, wires activating certain areas of neurons to simulate what these neurons would do by themselves, these sensory neurons. So now let's see where the low tones versus the high tones are.
Instead, specific areas along the basilar membrane move variably in response.
So this is now just the hair cells. This is only the hair cells, not the cochlea around them, not the fluid. This is just the areas where the hair cells are in just a little platform, essentially.
To different frequencies of sound. Lower frequencies vibrate the basilar membrane closer to the apex of the cochlea, whereas higher frequencies produce vibrations closer to the base.
So high sounds down here in the wider area, low sounds up here in the tighter area. Humans tend to lose the neurons here in the higher hearing area for the cochlea, so we often lose high sounds first and then low sounds the last as we are losing hearing over our lifespan. So that is how humans hear. We have little hair cells inside the cochlea in our ears. When they vibrate, they touch something, and that touching leads to them firing, and we interpret that sensory input of I've been touched to sound, which is pretty neat. We have similar hair cells around these areas as well, and those help us know, are we standing up, are we lying down, that kind of thing. So probably a little different than you might have expected previously. All right, so looking at the development of hearing over the lifespan, it is pretty clear that in the last 2 months of being a fetus can hear sounds. So speech exposure specifically seems to help language acquisition happen faster. So if you're speaking to a baby and obviously they're in a womb, like there's a lot of fluid there, you've got to kind of be a little bit loud. But speech around the pregnant person and speech directly to the baby does seem to make it easier for them to acquire language because they're already starting to practice with those sounds, with those tones. Their brain's already starting to be able to connect up some of those wires essentially to perceive sounds. There's also been studies of music. So back when I was young, there were maybe people still say this, that if you listen to classical music, your baby will be smarter or something like that. These things have been tested, doesn't work, doesn't matter what music you listen to, it doesn't have essentially any effect. If you listen to music loud enough to damage the baby's hearing, that would have an effect, but that would probably be damaging your hearing as well. So definitely don't do that. So with that ability to hear sounds in the little bit of time right before birth, it does seem like our brains are genetically programmed and we get that practice. We are very attuned in infancy to human speech. So the timbre, the volume, the rhythm of human speech, our brains are really good at focusing on that and processing that. So there probably are some genetic components to that, but it's also the practice. So, like a lot of these things with gross and fine motor skills and these sensory inputs, the best thing for a baby is to interact with them. Let them experience speech, music, touch, rhymes. Let them experience different languages. Let them experience different smells, different textures with their touch, different sights, different patterns, black and white, color, rainbows. And let them try to manipulate a variety of objects. Again, make sure these are safe and they're not going to like eat them. But yeah, let them explore things around them. Babies don't need really dramatic, fancy toys, blocks of different shapes and sizes and textures are pretty good for babies. So, pots and pans when they get a little bit older, these kinds of things. The main thing is this dynamic systems theory that they are using the systems around them, they are learning from people around them, and they are able to develop a variety of skills. So with this, newborns can't hear soft sounds very well, so it might seem a little strange, but you should be a little louder when talking to newborns to make sure that they can hear you. So oftentimes we'll talk really quietly. Sorry if I know like whispering in microphones is like nails on a chalkboard to me. So sorry if that's the case for you as well. But oftentimes we'll try to do like really soft voices for babies, and they probably can't hear us very well. So speak a little bit louder, so your normal volume that you would generally be talking to people, or a little bit louder than that. You don't have to be yelling at babies, but definitely a little bit louder than you might expect is really good. So perception of sound continues to improve till about 5 to 10, and by that time the brain is myelinated up enough, we've had enough practice that we're pretty much at adult levels of the perception of sounds. So also in infancy, higher pitches are easier to hear as well. So some people wonder, and we'll get to this with language ability actually, so maybe I'll skip that for now. But multiple languages is actually better for young children. So they'll become bi or trilingual quicker if they have multiple languages in their household. So with this, as we're looking at from that age about 10 or so through the rest of our lifespan, one of the biggest risks is loud sustained sounds. So loud sustained sounds are really bad for our hearing. So as we saw, those delicate structures, those hair cells are really, really small. There's a lot of delicate structures in the ear. Any mess ups there can really damage your hearing, lead to things like tinnitus or hearing loss. So if you're going to concerts, if you're riding a motorcycle, if you're doing work in a loud factory, wear the earplugs. Oftentimes, especially in like a factory setting, it's going to be required. Wear it. Definitely wear it. It's going to help. As someone with tinnitus, where I get ringing in my ears basically all the time, um, it would be great if it wasn't there. So definitely wear your hearing protection. For me, it's often been just forgetting it sometimes. Like I go to a concert, I get there and I'm like, oh no, my hearing protection's not here. Well, I'm not going home. I'm going to the concert. And now I have consistent ringing in my ears. So with that being said, take care of the ears that you have and the sensations that you have. You might have more hearing loss than other people. You can do things to maintain the capacities that you do have. And there are things like hearing aids that can help. There are things like cochlear implants that can help. Accessibility devices to help your capacities be maintained and interact with people. So like I mentioned, high-pitched sounds decline first. Those are in the wider part of the cochlea, and that can begin as early as 40. So if you don't have hearing damage, those high-pitched sounds might be lost as early as 40. It can happen earlier than that too, if you are not taking care of your ears. So with this, we do see that most significant declines start after age 70. And with that, we see, oh, also subtitles can really help. Subtitles I'm always about that. I use the subtitles so they distract me. That's also ADHD, but now I very much appreciate them, especially if I'm trying to have the volume really low and have the kids to bed as I'm watching a show. Subtitles can be really helpful in that kind of setting, especially when my wife's like, it's so loud, don't turn it up anymore. And I'm like, I can't hear it. So definitely use these kinds of tools to maintain the capacities that you do have. All right, hearing and vision loss together are some of the things that we see a lot of negative outcomes to. So as we get to 70, 75, 80, we see people losing those capacities with vision and hearing, and oftentimes we see them kind of retreating and not seeking social support, participating in social situations. With that, we see more loneliness, we see more cognitive decline. As if you remember the six things that are the biggest, these are some of the worst things to be doing at that time in late adulthood. So we see more depression, we see increased communication problems. So use accessibility devices. Use these tools that have been designed that can be useful. Obviously, you don't have to necessarily do, say, a cochlear implant because that is very invasive and there are risks with surgery in general. And they only work, I forget what the data was. They don't always work. I'll just say that. There is a learning curve because essentially you are relearning with a cochlear implant. So just be aware of that with people who are losing their hearing. Be patient with them. Be patient with people who might say, what? Multiple times. Be prepared to speak a little louder. This is what people need to make things accessible to them. All right, our skin, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the sensors in our skin, but we have a lot of them. And each of them can kind of work together to give you different sensations overall. But here are a bunch of them. So we've got 7 different types that are getting pain, heat, cold, touch. We've got pressure and touch, and these things can work together so that you can feel a difference between just like lightly pressing on your skin, pressing pretty hard, or if I like slammed my arm, like maybe a little bit of pain there, right? So these same sensors are working together and collaborating to send that sensation to your brain, and then you're perceiving it as, oh, that tickles, or oh, that's something's touching my arm, or oh, that really hurt, or something like that. So the sensation again is the raw data coming into your brain from these specialized neuron endings, these sensory organs. And the perception is, what does that mean? Is this a light touch? Is this pain? And this is actually one thing that I want to bring up with some information on chronic illnesses. Specifically, fibromyalgia is a form of chronic pain that can be very widespread. For some people, it's a little more localized. But for fibromyalgia, the two things that seem to be happening, and for any given person, it might be one of these two things, or it might be a combination of both of these things. It seems that a lot of the pain for people with fibromyalgia are either caused by the nerves themselves sending pain signals when they shouldn't be. So either just randomly sending pain signals where there should be no signal, or they sometimes are sending like this light touch that I'm doing where I'm just like barely touching my arm hairs, sending a pain signal from something that for most people you would just kind of be able to ignore. But to that person, their brain is getting a signal of pain, pain, pain. And that can be incredibly tough. The other thing that happens with people with fibromyalgia, it looks like their somatosensory cortex, so the area in the brain that is interpreting and perceiving these senses, so that area of the brain that says, oh, this is a light tickle, this is a harder pressure, oh, that's pain. That area of the brain can be interpreting anything as pain. And so that can be really very frustrating because there isn't a real cause of the pain. It is literally coming from their nerves themselves. But that is where pain is. Pain is in the nerves. So someone with fibromyalgia is having pain a lot of the time, and it's just there. There's not like they can't like stretch it away or like rub it away. The nerves just are saying pain, or the brain is saying pain. And even though it's not like some physical cause on the outside, it's that physical cause within the neurons. If they're sending a message of pain, you're feeling pain. And so that's a really hard thing for people to deal with. Fibromyalgia is also pretty annoying to get diagnosed as well, because there are things that can cause other things that could cause chronic pain. So you might have arthritis and fibromyalgia. You might be being treated for the arthritis, and that is helping the arthritis symptoms, but you still have fibromyalgia. So for fibromyalgia, most people have to kind of narrow it down, cut out every other possible thing that could cause this pain. And then after everything's cut out, it's like, well, the pain's still there. It must be fibromyalgia at this point. So that can be a really long process for people to get diagnosed. But yeah, that is two of the main things that are happening. Either the nerves are kind of sending signals of pain when there shouldn't be, or the brain is interpreting pain when it shouldn't be interpreting pain. So that can be a very tough thing. So that is not all the senses in the body. That is just a couple that we'll focus on in the lecture. But hopefully that gives you a lot better sense of how the body works together with our senses and perception. Again, those senses are the raw data. So the raw data from this nerve ending is then perceived as a touch by us. The raw data of light from that black and white picture that I thought was a dog, that raw data is a sensation, and the perception is, oh, I see a dog. So that's also one of the reasons it's really easy for humans to see faces in things, because we are very attuned to looking for the patterns of faces. So if people see faces in bread or things like that, it's because our brains are really, really good at seeing both the human silhouette as well as faces. So faces more than the human silhouette, but we're pretty good at spotting humans, the human shape in places as well. So that is it for this chapter. So do remember to make sure you are looking at your syllabus to know what the next chapter we are reading in your class is.